Fred has remarked that I'm at a stage now in this particular work of what he refers to as fermentation, a process that all Episcopalians are expert in. And it is true, this is the first time that I've offered the course, and so it's the beginning of a process of my seeing what the lines of development are. One of the most interesting that I've uncovered so far is that between the Muslim theologian Ibn Sina and John Calvin. As I mentioned in the overall description for discussion number 4, this is a part of the process by which European thought went through a seismic philosophical change from assuming the work of Plato as the operating axiom of thought to assuming the work of Aristotle. This was not in any sense an easy process. We already saw last week in considering Thomas Aquinas that the result was in some cases a formal accusation of heresy. So deeply rooted was the understanding that Plato should be the point of departure rather than Aristotle. Nonetheless, within the field of understanding the massive structures of reality, both the perceptible world and also the world of essences, Thomas Aquinas was able to make out a case that Aristotle enabled us to understand the world of nature and also the world of grace and their interactions. Thomas Aquinas was able to do that, as we also saw last week, on the basis of the work of commentary of his Muslim predecessor, Ibn Rushd, whose name, for reasons only a Latinist could explain, ends up being transferred into Averroes in English. But in the previous century, in Cordova in present-day Spain, Ibn Rushd had made Aristotle available in a way that then could influence both Thomas Aquinas and Aquinas' teacher, Albertus Magnus. That referred to the way in which the major perceptible structures of reality were related to a single causative principle. This week, I'm looking not at that larger macrocosmic perspective, but rather at the microcosm of the human soul in particular. How can we understand ourselves in relation to God on an Aristotelian basis? And the focus of that issue was taken up by John Calvin within his Institutes of the Christian Religion, to which I'll turn in just a moment. But I'm delaying in turning to Calvin for the simple reason that just as Aquinas was dependent upon the work of Ibn Rushd, so John Calvin was dependent on the work of Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina posed this question about the soul long before Calvin did. He posed it in specifically Aristotelian terms, and those terms of reference in turn were subsumed by John Calvin within his theology. So it comes out very interestingly out of the Reformation, despite all the differences between John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas, is a common resort to Aristotle as being the presupposition of all theological and philosophical discourse. That surprising agreement has largely lasted until this day. And we'll see next week that it underlines the commitment to scientific inquiry that characterizes the modern age, because what we call scientific is really Aristotle's natural philosophy, only, as we'll see, in a renovated form. So what we're looking at is how it is that you could conceive of reality, both writ large in the case of Thomas Aquinas and writ on the interior of human identity in the case of John Calvin, and we're seeing how in both instances we're seeing the application of insights that had already been made within Islam. Ibn Sina, in fact, precedes Ibn Rushd, to whom we were introduced last week. He died in 1037. He lived far to the east in relation to Ibn Rushd. He grew up in a town called Bukhara in present-day Uzbekistan, which at that time was a major center of learning. It was possible for him to be exposed to Aristotle within that setting and from a relatively early age. He, in fact, went through an extensive period of spiritual crisis as a teenager because he read Aristotle and could not understand him. All our teenagers should have such difficulties. Ibn Sina took it deeply to heart and would not give up on understanding Aristotle. So he decided to use the same method that he had used to understand the Quran. He decided, I'll memorize Aristotle's metaphysics. Then if I've memorized them and recited them to myself, I will come to understand them, and he did. And in doing so, he offered a way of comprehending Aristotle that serves until this day. What he saw is that Aristotle offered an alternative to Plato for a single specific reason, and that is that in positing that there's such a thing as a single necessary being in the whole universe, Aristotle therefore had also to explain how this one necessary being results in the manifold appearances around us. And Ibn Sina, reading Aristotle, concluded this is because of the nature of causation. Causation is a much more complex reality than we understand. And when Ibn Sina's Aristotle looks at causation, it is not a simple matter of mechanical cause and effect. It is that, but that is only literally 1/4 of the phenomenon. That is, cause and effect as we understand it is included within it. But when Ibn Sina looks at that phenomenon, he also concludes that there could be no efficient cause, as he refers to that. There could be no efficient cause unless first there were matter that had actually been produced. And then also there was a design of that matter. Then you can have an efficient cause. So if we imagine just for a moment 2 billiard balls, we all know, because we've read our Isaac Newton, if we roll one ball towards the other responds in an equal and opposite fashion. That's the efficient cause. But for that to be, you have to have the billiard balls made of something, and by the way, they do have to be spherical. So the matter and the form are built into causation along with the efficient cause, and then finally, in Ibn Sina's Aristotle, there has to be the cause that wraps up the earlier causes and which also gives meaning to the whole. And this you can see in the first extract from Ibn Sina on the first page in his work simply called Concerning the Soul. So you can see he is truly looking at the interior of existence. The soul is a single genus divisible in some way into three parts. The first is the vegetable soul, which is the first entelechy of a natural body. Oh, a new word, entelechy. We haven't run across that before. And in fact, before Aristotle, no one had run into it before, because Aristotle made the word entelechia up. He made it up out of the Greek terms entelos, which means purpose in itself, and the Greek verb echein, which means to have. So entelechia, which is here been passed through Arabic and into English as entelechy, entelechia refers to having purpose in itself. Purpose is a part of causation. As separate from purpose, there is no adequate description of any phenomenon. An arrow can only be known and understood on the basis of its relationship to a target and all of the individual factors before the moment it strikes the target. So it is in the case of every phenomenon that there will ever be, including, he argues, the soul of a human being. So he's going to refer to the different levels of soul here, but each of them has its own purpose within itself that is a part of its very being. Apart from that causative purpose, in Aristotelian terms, there is no reality whatsoever. And so the first is the vegetable soul, which is the first entelechy of a natural body, possessing organs insofar as it is reproduced, grows, and assimilates nourishment. You can assimilate nourishment and reproduce. That he refers to as being vegetative, because he realizes plants, on this understanding, have a kind of soul. So, at the level of reproduction and nourishment, do you. But it doesn't stop there. He goes on to explain a bit about soul, but then he goes on 2 lines later to say the second part of the soul is the animal soul, which is the first entelechy of a natural body possessing organs insofar as it perceives individuals and moves by volition. That is, he sees animals as defined by a soul whose purpose, whose entelechy is animals move, animals respond. They can perceive individuals. Because they have action and response, it doesn't mean they have will, but there's a difference of an animal entelechy and a vegetative entelechy. So when you're at lunch, you're like a tree. But when you walk from lunch someplace else, you're more like an animal. Do you ever become something different? On good days, he argues, yes. So he goes on, the third is the human soul, which is the first entelechy of a natural body possessing organs, insofar as it acts by rational choice and rational deduction, and insofar as it perceives universals. So, you are a human soul insofar as you are rational. It is, he judges, your rationality that makes you human, and the entelechy, the purpose in itself of your rationality, is to perceive universals in all the diversity of this world. That is, when you perceive the universals, you are also perceiving how it is that Allah, as the first cause, has produced all of this multiform reality that we see around us. Like Ibn Rushd and Thomas Aquinas, Ibn Sina is assuming that the world you perceive is a real world, but he's asking himself, how is it we can reach that conclusion? It's because we have a rational soul whose very existence is predicated on God's necessary being and the quality that necessary being has to produce various contingent beings around it. So how is it that we deploy this uniquely human trait of rationality in order to perceive the universals? He goes on in the second excerpt to say, there are some faculties of internal perception which perceive the form of sensed things, and some which perceive their intention. Some faculties, again, can perceive and act, while others only perceive and do not act. So there are two levels of distinction that he's making here. One is the ability of the human soul to perceive in phenomena the form that they are being confronted with, but then you have the deeper capacity, which is to understand a phenomenon from the point of view of its intention. Intention is another way of referring to entelecheia, to the purpose it is heading towards. So when you perceive not only your own purpose, but when you perceive the purpose of an exterior phenomenon, you are actually perceiving with the same rationality with which Allah creates. You are joining with Allah in an understanding of the way the universe is constructed. And then he also believes that on the basis of this intention that you perceive in a given phenomenon, you might perceive and act accordingly, and you might perceive and not act. Now, sometimes you perceive and act because the intention you perceive in another person is a threat, in which case your action is entirely, as we would say, natural. But it's also animal, because that's responding. Sometimes you just need to respond because of who we happen to be, but our aim is not perception in order to act. The ultimate aim, which will make us happy in Aristotelian terms, is different. And that's what we come to in the third excerpt, just on the bottom of page 1. It should be seen how some of these faculties govern others. You will find the acquired intellect to be the governor whom all the rest serve. It is the ultimate goal. Here we are again with this very, very clear interest in the goal, the telos of entelecheia. The acquired intellect is the ultimate goal. The intellectus in habitu, that is, the intellectual faculty that we acquire, serves the intellectus in actu. That is, intellect in action is fine, but it is there to serve the intellect that doesn't act, but simply perceives. Is in turn served by the material intellect with all its capacities. The practical intellect, what you do daily, serves them all for attachment to the body, as will shortly become clear, exists for the sake of the perfection and purification of the theoretical intellect, and the practical intellect governs this relationship. That is, we are actually built for the perfection and purification of theoretical intellect. And here, Ibn Sina is using the term theoretical in its proper, again, Greek sense. Theoretical means theoreo, what you see, what you perceive. So your capacity to understand necessary being is the entelechia, is the purposive existence of the human soul. That's Ibn Sina's basic conviction, which, if you'll remember, is also in agreement with Aristotle's definition of happiness. Happiness for Aristotle was also, by modern standards, a passive occupation, a matter of participating in what is ultimately true by insight, not by action. So in Aristotle, in Ibn Sina as well, action is not privileged. In fact, action is understood as something which should always serve a contemplative purpose, and to that extent must always be kept under control. This may sound familiar to those who have encountered a version of Calvinist Christianity in which what a person does is not held to be the most important factor in that person's relationship to God. The basic conception that faith matters more than works, that Protestant ideal, is also an Aristotelian norm, is saying we were never built for the purpose of works in any case. The fact that we happen to mess up in some regard is therefore always going to be secondary to the primary preoccupation, which ultimately is this contemplative link with God. So let's turn now and see how John Calvin works precisely this connection out and how he applies it within his own setting. It's worth reflecting that his own setting in Geneva is one in which he is, at the height of his powers, effectively in control of the city. He is certainly the most important power within it. He is attempting to frame the city in such a way that it comes to be compared by his supporters to a philosophical academy. A philosophical academy for the study of Christ, with the understanding that he is deploying his own philosophical understanding in order to regulate the norms of the city of Geneva in such a way that the result will tend towards salvation. On what basis can Calvin do that? Early on in his Institutes, he speaks deliberately in an anthropological way rather than theological. That is, he begins with his understanding of the way in which human beings are constituted. And that understanding is remarkably like Ibn Sina's. So he writes, there is within the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, an awareness of divinity. This we take to be beyond controversy. To prevent anyone from taking refuge in the pretense of ignorance, God himself has implanted in all men a certain understanding of his divine majesty. Ever renewing its memory, he repeatedly sheds drops. And here he alludes to two different authors, but these two different authors are coordinated with one another. He refers to St. Paul writing to the Romans, where in Romans he insists to his readers that in fact all humanity does have an innate understanding of God. And the only reason that people ever turned to idolatry was they deliberately misunderstood this implanted knowledge. So here Calvin is using St. Paul as a source, but he's also using Cicero. And you remember that Stoicism has been a powerful influence in the background of Christianity. What's going on here is that Calvin is picking up both St. Paul and Cicero the Stoic, and is moving them now in an increasingly Aristotelian direction. And the reason for that is that in Calvin's understanding, the reason for our acquired knowledge that God exists is that as we grow to know ourselves, we come to know our shortcomings. We see the ways in which we fall short. We understand ourselves as being entirely contingent beings. So for Calvin, the contingency of human self-knowledge brings about the awareness that there must be a being who is not contingent, but is rather necessary. He comes to that same grounding insight that Ibn Sina and Aristotle had used. And at the same time, Calvin also clearly shows us why, for him, when he speaks of sin, he is not simply talking about the particular misdeeds of one person or another. He'll talk about that too, because he is the equivalent of the mayor of the town, and he knows there's a lot of sin about. But sin, in his perspective, has a particular purpose, because your sinfulness is what makes you aware of God by contrast. Your sinfulness leads directly to your insight that you are not God, unless you are a particularly disturbed personality, which might show itself by dyeing your hair funny colors or some other symptom. You don't mistake yourself for God, but also you realize, because of your shortcomings, and because they are your shortcomings, that it must be that some other being endowed you with life and yet doesn't have those faults. For him, sinfulness is not the same as guilt. Sinfulness is a condition in which you live, which is intended, its entelechia is to bring about your awareness of that which does not sin, which is not you, but is God. This, however, is, from a human point of view, fragile knowledge. It is difficult to bring oneself to the point of seeing, oh, my fault shows me something immensely invaluable. Usually when we encounter our faults, we're not happy about it. We cover it up, we justify it, we try to pretend it's a strength. It requires a moment of reflection for us to see the actual purpose of our own perception of sinfulness. And that is what Calvin insists upon, and also he shows his motivation in attempting to structure a city that will promote contemplation of necessary being. And so he writes in the second excerpt, "Besides, if all men are born and live to the end that they may know God," there aren't too many more Aristotelian clauses than that one. All men are born and live to the end that they may know God, and yet, if knowledge of God is unstable and fleeting, unless it progresses to this degree, it is clear that all those who do not direct every thought and action in their lives to this goal degenerate from the law of their creation. If the purpose of life in humanity, if its entelechia is knowledge of God, everything else is a waste of time and a degeneration from the intent of creation. Look what he goes on to say. This was not unknown to the philosophers. Give them their due. And here he's talking to pre-Christian philosophy. Plato meant nothing but this when he often taught that the highest good of the soul is likeness to God, where when the soul has been grasped the knowledge of God, it is wholly transformed into its likeness. So he's arguing that the philosophical idea and the Christian ideal are one and the same. And he sees this as worked out also within the social relations around him. He is very famous in his Geneva for his severity in punishing obviously degenerate, as he would call it, and wicked behavior, like wearing ribbons in your hair, and dancing, and talking loudly in taverns, and getting drunk publicly, and generally behaving the way Americans do every weekend. And Calvin saw this as an example of people being moved from their actual purpose of life and degenerating against the very law of nature. There is no question but that he actually did these things. But the end, it must be borne in mind, is not the control of behavior as such. It is ultimately for the purpose of the visio Dei, of the vision of God. And he believed that when you successfully corrected someone and brought about a reformation, you had just contributed to that person's enlightenment as well as to that person's salvation. So he goes on to state, and this is the third entry here, from this, my present contention is brought out with greater certainty, that a sense of divinity is by nature engraven on human hearts. For necessity forces from the reprobate themselves a confession of it. This is one of his distinctive ideas of what's a reprobate? What is a person who is degenerated from creation? That's someone who has forgotten his or her purpose in the vision of God. And you always want to bring such people back. And you use the methods of discipline and law in order to achieve that aim. And so he writes of the reprobate, in tranquil times they wittily joke about God, indeed are facetious and garrulous in belittling his power. In any occasion for despair possesses upon them, it goes them to seek him and impels their perfunctory prayers. From this it is clear that they have not been utterly ignorant of God, that what should have come forth sooner was held back by stubbornness. So because you can see that there is a certain willfulness in human ignorance, that people are in fact not without knowledge, but wish to evade this knowledge, it is an authentic duty of the state to bring this knowledge to the surface as much as possible. You can see by their own behavior that the reprobate actually will go in this direction as soon as necessity arises. So why not let them know early that the necessity is there? For Calvin, this brings about an understanding of how one is to conduct one's life in the present, because that conduct, which is consistent with the vision of God, is in turn what determines one's destiny even after this life. And so he writes, knowledge of this sort, then, ought not only to arouse us to the worship of God, but also to awaken and encourage us to the hope of the future life. That is, if you have the ability at the moment to have insight into God as the only necessary being, then you see that even after this life, there's the prospect of participating in that same being. He goes on to say, for we notice that the examples that the Lord shows us, both of his clemency and his severity, are inchoate and incomplete. That is, at the moment, we can see signs of clemency, we can see God correcting people towards the visio Dei, but these are incomplete actions. But that suggests, if we can perceive an incomplete action, that this action will be completed, because that's the nature of its entelechia, that it will go on to the point of its purpose. And so he says, doubtless, we must consider this to presage even greater things, the manifestation and full exhibition of which are deferred to another life. So that final clemency of God and that final severity of God, his two responses to human beings, as they either participate in the visio Dei or pretend to ignorance, means that human beings are destined by their actions to be a part of God's clemency or to be a part of God's severity. Welcome to predestination. We have just seen that the Aristotelian principle of entelechia, as assimilated by John Calvin, results in an understanding according to which human beings themselves are taken up in the purposefulness of God's necessary being in such a way that what they do, either participating in the visio Dei or insistently renouncing it, leads to their final destiny. He develops that understanding on a philosophical basis, which is one of the reasons that it has continued to exert power. It is not an arbitrary teaching about hell and heaven. It is rather part of a philosophical vision based upon the very same philosophy, that of Aristotle, which has been ever more shaping European and Mediterranean and Near Eastern culture since the time of Ibn Sina. Thanks very much. Yes, please. What an excellent question. The question was, which I'll repeat for the Cardinal of Red Hook, were any of these people married and with children? Ibn Sina was quite a prosperous man with a family. He got a conscience about owning slaves at the end of his life, and therefore he set his slaves free shortly before his death in 1037. John Calvin was very happily married, had children, and used the model of fatherhood to conceive not only of God, but also of the pastor in a local community. He thought that his doctrine of sin was to be commended both because it was philosophically responsible in Aristotelian terms, but also because it was also pragmatic, that any parent of children should understand that sinning is an endemic human tendency that has to be coped with. Yes, please, Tess. This is a very interesting question. The relationship between John Calvin's understanding of sin and the Roman Catholic idea of original sin. I would say that in their basic structures, they actually conflict. And I'll explain the two, and I'll explain why I think they conflict. And then, unfortunately, there's an irony in all this. So first, definitionally, sin in John Calvin, we have already seen. That you know yourself, you know you're sinning, fine. I got it. And I also am aware that the production of sin in me lets me be aware of the source of my being, and lets me be aware that the source of my being is itself not sinful. And so basically, this is the anthropological engine of all spirituality, and is, in a sense, something that makes sinning good, because my sin makes me aware of God. Everyone who investigates this line of thought, where sin makes you aware of God, has to face the consequence that it means that there's something ultimately good about sin. Paul had to face it, Martin Luther had to face it, Augustine had to. That's why Augustine even refers to sin by referring to it as the felix culpa. Oh, happy fault. Why is sin happy? Because of what it leads to. Because it brings about an awareness of God that produces redemption. So I think that Calvin takes that Pauline, early Augustinian, Lutheran thought and applies it in an Aristotelian context brilliantly, which means that now it has a philosophical foundation which would only with great difficulty be shaken. It really wasn't shaken until the 20th century. 20th century shook all kinds of things. Some of them should have been, some of them should not have been. Anyway, but then we have this idea of original sin. Now this is also Augustine. No one teaches original sin until St. Augustine. And what he has to say about original sin, as classically defined, is actually somewhat at odds with his own thought, and therefore is also at odds with Calvin's thought. Why? Because Augustine asks himself the question, all right, all human beings are sinful. Why would that be? Well, obviously there was this original mistake of Adam and Heva, whom he calls Adam and Eve. He thinks of them as being people. We know that their names, in Hebrew, Adam means dirt person made of dirt, and Heva means mother. Right? But all right, he thinks of them as being, as it were, specific human beings in the past. So how did their mistake get transmitted to us? Well, they saw they were naked, so they hadn't understood that they were naked until they had the forbidden fruit. So obviously they had sex. Text doesn't say that, but obvious, right? Because remember, Augustine was a former Manichaean. And in my judgment, he never left his Manichaean ideas behind, according to which everything that's connected with the flesh, by its very nature, is evil. So that first sexual act, according to this myth that Augustine spins out of Genesis, that first sexual act was an act of lust. And in fact, all sexual acts are acts of lust instead of love. And therefore, you are literally conceived in sin, because you have these two lust machines generating what will become a fetus. Augustine was one of the greatest theologians of his age, and I think everyone is permitted to have a bad idea from time to time. This is his. Unfortunately, when you're a great theologian, people might take your bad ideas more readily than the good ones, and this one is a great bad idea. It's a great bad idea because it means that all married people can now be made to feel inferior to celibate clergy. I mean, who could resist such an idea if you're the head of an organization that has celibate clergy? And it's also a way of being able to say to little children, you are sinful from your birth. It's just the way you were born. And therefore, you require correction in order to understand anything of God. But that's not Calvin's idea. It's not Paul's idea. And it wasn't Augustine's idea either when he said felix culpa, of sin. You see why I think the idea of original sin is more Manichaean than it is anything else. So in my judgment, they are different. It's clear they're different, and that their whole logical background and consequence different. However, the Protestant reformers, when they threw out a great deal of what should have been thrown out, in my judgment, did not throw out original sin. And so Calvin, in the end, convinced as he was pragmatically of the pervasiveness of sin, in fact adapted it. And it finds its way into the Anglican 39 Articles, with some prevarication, but that's the nature of the 39 Articles. So that Protestant organizations in the 16th and 17th century did not perceive what I just referred to, namely this historical distinction between the understanding of sin as original and as basically unbreakable, which is the original sin concept, and the conception of sin as that which leads by contrast to an understanding of God. I think at the very least you have to decide which one of those two is going to be your point of departure. And I would actually recommend it would be wiser simply to jettison the concept of original sin. I don't think it's done much good to anyone. Yes, please, Nicole. This is a very interesting question posed by an interesting person, because Nicole Carroll, a graduate of the college, majoring in religion, now works for the Bard Prison Initiative, for which we thank her. And it also helps to explain the background of the question: what sort of influence does Calvin have on the present system of incarceration? And I would suggest that the present system does not take enough lessons from Calvin. Yes, clearly, Calvin believed in the capacity of the city to shape human behavior. He thought that there should be discipline as well as punishment. In Calvin's Geneva, you could be fined for not going to church. I think it's a great idea, but I suppose a majority would not agree with me. However, when it came to the kinds of punishment you would mete out, on the whole, his standard was what is going to produce this behavior which is consistent with a person's role in life as understanding God, which made him tend to insist in his discussion with the city council on the role of clemency. And I'll give the most famous example of all this. Michael Servetus in Calvin's Geneva was burnt at the stake. And he was burnt at the stake for being too much of an Aristotelian, basically. He was an early Unitarian, and he opposed the Trinity. John Calvin agreed he should be put in jail because he opposed the Trinity. But he also publicly asked the city council not to execute Michael Servetus. And Calvin did not get his way. They killed him. And ironically, Calvin then received letters of praise from both Protestants and Catholics because in the end, Geneva had done the right thing in executing Michael Servetus. In fact, given his intention, John Calvin's purpose was to bring about a change in Michael Servetus, rather than to exact a punishment itself. It seems to me if you ask about the present system of incarceration, its aim does not appear primarily to be improvement whatsoever. Our language is that of paying one's debt to society. Well, first, I don't think you owe society a penny. And in any case, you aren't benefiting society by being in prison. That picture, paying your debt, is literally pre-Calvinist. That's the medieval understanding of retribution by paying in kind for any kind of crime. So Calvin represents an advance beyond that medieval understanding. It's something that someone like Anselm of Canterbury would have agreed with, this notion of payment. But Calvin opposes that where it concerns the way in which you need to deal with behavior which is either wrong or criminal. We would disagree with him in his definition of what amounts to wrong behavior. I mean, without any question, he would have banned Episcopalians just for being Episcopalians. But I think we can agree with his notion that once you've understood that a form of behavior is to be revised, the purpose is the revision of the person and not simply payment for having done that action. I think I'll wait to see you next week. Thank you.